Welcome to the 9th edition of the Saint Petersburg Florida Area News Podcast for the year 2019. I'm your host, Joshua Black, and this episode will cover the City Council committee meetings held on February 28th. This episode is a bit more detailed than most previous episodes, but there is a good reason for that. But first, we must pause because Councilmember Lisa Wheeler Bowman had a death in her family last week and has been absent for the last two meetings. Please keep her in your prayers. The first committee of the day was the Budget, Finance, and Taxation Committee, also known as BF&T. Council received a quarterly financial report from Anne Fritz. As she gave her report about city investments, Charlie Gerdes, Council Chair but Committee Vice Chair, asked what legal issues might arise if the city invested some of the monies tied up in bonds to make loans to local businesses who couldn't get loans elsewhere. His reasoning is that the city could probably get the same rate of return on investment as they were getting for the bonds. He might be right, but it isn't his money. Sad how willing he is to risk other people's money, especially after forcing them to pay it into city coffers in the first place. The city council's attorney told him it's probably illegal to do it anyway. As she continued her report, Anne made the claim that the city's investment strategy is to buy staple investments for the most part. 21% of their portfolio is U.S. Treasury bonds, so your taxes are funding the federal deficit spending too. Staying away from investments rated BBB or lower by general policy. When Ed Montanari, Council Vice Chair but Chair of this committee, pointed out that a recent investment in AT&T was rated BBB rather than BBB+, she explained that the downgrade happened after the city purchased the bonds and the investment term was only for 1 year versus a 5 years or longer generally sought. When Gerdes asked about dire predictions for the future of the market, Anne said that the types of investments the city holds are generally the kinds of investments that other investors seek during a bad market. Thus, the city expects to have its holdings increase in value during a recession should it occur. Gerdes also asked about liquidity and responded that the city investment team timed the maturity of some bonds and other investment certificates to coincide with expected increases in city expenditures. On page 64 of the 262-page Council Committee report, Anne showed that the pension funds for the city's employees are generally solvent, with the fire department having the best position overall, followed by most other employees and then by the police. On page 67, she also noted that the $216,786 balance shown for the Wikiwachi Fund was actually inaccurate because the balance at the end of January was more than $1.1 million. That became important later in the day. The next committee to meet was the Public Services and Infrastructure Committee. Normally, Steve Cornell leads this committee as chair, but Ed Montanari, the vice chair of the committee, was leading that too because Cornell had a prior engagement. The first matter was a presentation in favor of applying the name of recently deceased Benjamin F. Shirley to the administrative building of the sanitation department where he worked for so long. During and after the presentation, everyone spoke of his humility and servant leadership during his tenure. The proposal was unanimously recommended to full council for final approval. The next proposal regarded an idea called responsible wage. Basically, most members of city council think they can blithely ignore the laws of economics to achieve their societal goals, which has been evident for the few months that I've been monitoring them. Staff objected to the proposal, stating that the two current wage regulations were already making it more difficult for the procurement department to get bids from vendors for city projects. The living wage standard applies to all services, while the prevailing wage for apprentices applies to construction trades. The responsible wage mandate would apply to more trades in the apprenticeship program. The associated higher costs limit the pool of qualified companies, but both Gerdes and Gina Driscoll insisted that companies that pay less aren't the kinds of people they want to hand these contracts to. I don't think the city government should be doing these projects anyway. If they are that necessary, let the people closer to the situation raise the funds and choose a contractor or 10 to do the job. The city government should be focused on crime victims, not cosmetics. Of course, that's not what staff proposed. Staff requested that the city council wait until July to try to implement the new wage standard to give staff time to adjust to the monitoring software they're using to track compliance with the apprentice wage mandate. Driscoll objected, saying it is better to overcome all the bumps in the roads together instead of having two distinct learning curve periods. Staff responded they don't have the manpower to enforce compliance. Driscoll insisted that the software actually makes enforcement more efficient. Councilmember Amy Foster strenuously objected to the presence of waivers given by administration of the apprenticeship standard for construction projects awarded after the wage ordinance had passed. Staff pointed out that one of the incidents, a project in Carillon Park, had been put out for bid twice and had only received one offer, and that from a company that was not a full participant in the state's apprenticeship program, which is one of the requirements of the wage standard. The choices were to go with an unqualified but capable company or to be forced to increase the payout, an issue that Montanari had sought to address before the final vote but had not received cooperation from the same staff member after a full month. Montanari didn't bring that up, though. Deputy Mayor Dr. Kanika Tomlin said that any future projects awarded with waivers of the apprenticeship prevailing wage mandate would generate a full report to council. This came up later. Gerdes offered a compromise, saying that the effective date for the responsible wage proposal should be implemented later but passed now. The rest of the committee seemed to be on board. The next committee was the Housing, Land Use, and Transportation Committee, chaired now by Brandy Gabbard. This meeting started later than desired because of the need for a quorum. Gabbard and Darden Rice were the only two members of the committee present for the scheduled time, with Wheeler Bowman out for the aforementioned family loss and Cornell out with his prior engagement. So the committee had to wait for Driscoll because neither Montanari nor Gerdes were voting members of the committee. Nobody died, but Gabbard noted that delays like this cost committee participants during lunchtime. The committee met to address zoning changes that could be brought to address the lack of affordable housing inside city limits. But first, Rice pointed out that there was a June 27 deadline for getting a referendum for taxes to fund housing subsidies on the ballot in the fall. Gabbard noted that the committee would need to hear and pass it on to full council by April. Here's hoping that they fail. Derek Kilborn, manager of urban planning and historic preservation, gave 3 out of 4 plan presentations for trying to change the zoning and land use regulations to make life less expensive for developers to provide lower priced units. The first proposal was to reduce parking requirements. The existing regulations can be found starting on page 16 of the HLUT PDF, and Derek used that format to highlight proposed changes to the code to reduce parking requirements. Committee members generally sided with more aggressive reductions in the provision mandates, but Driscoll objected to reductions for downtown because of the severe parking scarcity already in place. Behind motions from Rice, the committee moved forward the proposals for reducing parking requirements, but Rob Gerdes objected when one of Rice's motions included a requirement for commercial space on the ground level of apartment complexes in exchange for an exemption from providing parking. He stated that the council should include an exemption for subsidized housing, particularly public housing, because part of the operating budget for Saint Petersburg Housing Authority comes from sales tax credits, which, as was noted in the previous committee of the whole meeting with the St. Pete Housing Authority, is compromised when commercial uses, office or retail, are included on the building site. Kilborn advised that the exemption Rob Gerdes sought could be added later, thus the committee moved the matter forward without it. Supply and demand should control parking, not government mandates. Government mandates cause waste because the market isn't allowed to adjust to the best use of the property in question. One of the mandates on the books today insists that an apartment complex must provide a certain number of maintained parking spaces, which number can be reduced if the building is primarily for low-income renters, so long as the ground area for the spaces that are no longer required because of the exemption is maintained as green or unimproved space that is held in reserve, just in case the complex later becomes more profit-oriented, which is ludicrous because older buildings don't command higher rents later in life. The committee was eager to strike that requirement. Another zoning change would be to allow for garage apartments and the like, called accessory dwelling units, on the plots of single-family homes in all neighborhood traditional and neighborhood suburban zones. There is still a requirement for permitting and other processes, but this would allow new income properties to be built where they are currently prohibited. Mostly, accessory dwelling units are achieved by retrofitting existing structures such as garages, but new buildings could also be included under this proposal. This is the kind of apartment I lived in for the first 8 months I spent in St. Petersburg when I moved here back into November 2007. So I was actually unaware of the restrictions on it. The committee moved forward changes for neighborhood traditional, but not for neighborhood suburban. The third kind of zoning change that Kilbourne presented will allow for a new zoning category he called the missing middle. This designation recognizes that certain larger homes in St. Petersburg have already been retrofitted to become multifamily dwellings and allows new construction to meet those same standards with structural criteria adjusted to the number of units. As a delivery driver and taxi driver, I've seen these gigantic homes with originally 10 or 15 rooms converted into smaller, affordable dwelling units in Old Northeast, something Darlene Rice also mentioned since it's part of her council district. The committee advanced this proposal as well. All I could think of when I read the proposal is that the city's going to end up looking like Houston, but St. Petersburg is going to deprive a lot more people of valuable resources while we get there and won't reap the benefits. Houston has allowed these kinds of developments for years, having lightened the oppressive hand of government on the housing market. The result is that the cost of housing is actually lower in that city of $4 million than it is in this city of $250,000. The committee ran out of time before Kilbourne could present on Florida Area ratio bonuses, so we'll have to attend the next meeting on March 28th to cover that report. After lunch, the agenda review for council meeting for March 14th took place with Cornell in attendance. The administration pulled an item from the consent agenda A because of Dr. Tomlin's promise earlier in the day to give a full report on any contracts awarded with apprenticeship waivers. Cornell also added a new business item to spend $650,000 in Wikiwachi funds on a project for his district. He mentioned that he had been wondering if he should hold off until the fund improved, but Gerdes told him that Anne Fritz had given them the update from January that indicated that the funding was there. Also, we can expect fireworks during the E2 presentation. Staff wants to move forward with design funding for a project that might not get completed because the feds haven't released the funding yet. Montanari doesn't like the idea of spending the money early, but PSTA is threatening to exclude any further artwork from the design if there is a delay, and this is for the bus rapid transit shelters. At 2:30, the Committee of the Whole convened to discuss EMS growth management plan deferred at a previous city council meeting. Basically, Pinellas County is trying to catch up with most of the rest of the country and only send out one transport vehicle, that is the contractor Sunstar, when it isn't a true emergency. These are alpha calls. This would keep emergency response vehicles available for true emergency calls, that is Bravo level and above. Fire Chief Large stated that the assessment of calls fielded by the fire department last year showed that there were 359 times in which fire department resources had to delay a response to actually critical calls versus 33 times when calls were dispatched as alpha that should have been higher priority. They would rather have had the resources on hand and not already deployed to respond more quickly to the more emergent calls. Presumably, this would also shorten response times for the calls that start lower and get escalated higher. Fire Chief Womack also said that the fire department wants to wants to start implementing more care responses, such as sending a lone EMT, not even paramedic, which is currently the lowest level of dispatched response team member, including for Sunstar. A lone EMT to respond to care-only calls on an as-needed basis. Honestly, I'm sad this isn't already happening. The reason it isn't is that people who don't know what else to do in a medical situation they haven't prepared for call 911, whether it is the best option or not. And this is because services offered through 911 are not billed immediately or directly. If it were, this would mean there could be competition and reason introduced into the medical service marketplace, but that would mean the end of a tax-funded fire department and ambulance service, so that wasn't on the table. The committee members didn't even have intelligent questions to ask, despite spending one-on-one time with the chiefs during 2 weeks between the council meeting where this was deferred and the committee of the whole that took place on Thursday. Gabbard asked if Sunstar would be able to handle the increased volume. Problem: Sunstar is already responding to all of these calls already. Their workload wouldn't change one way or the other. The fire department does not transport anyone to the hospital. They do some preliminary work and hand the patient off to Sunstar. Adopting this protocol would mean not sending the fire department when the preliminary work isn't necessary. It would increase the response time for alpha calls from 5.6 minutes to close to 10 minutes, but the fire department would be responding more quickly to more urgent calls. Rice asked if the dispatchers are trained well enough to know how to dispatch calls with the right codes. I almost laughed myself out of the room. Was she listening to the same testimony? Alpha level calls that the fire department is asking permission not to respond to, which are only 2 codes in the alpha level, not even all of the alpha codes, represent 4,833 of the calls they responded to in 2018. They may only have dispatched 33 of them improperly, and they explained 16 of them. Only 17 times out of the 4,833 times did people receive an alpha response who needed Bravo or more urgent. This is with language barriers, accents, and people unfamiliar with medical technology, which is most of us calling in. The dispatchers know what they're doing. My wife used to be one. Foster asked if choosing not to answer 4,833 calls is actually lightening the load on the department. She said that it doesn't seem to have a statistical difference when compared to the number of fire stations, saying that it will make one unit more available per day. However, that's exactly the result the fire department is asking for, to be able to more quickly respond to 359 calls that got longer response times because the department was tied up with alpha calls. One freer unit in an entire department per day is 365 occasions of faster service for calls more urgent than alpha, not to mention one freer unit per day from each station. Did she do any math at all? Cornell brought up the fact that the same 2 chiefs had fiercely opposed a similar measure some years ago. Chief Womack stated that the reason he was amenable to this change this time is that the text of the interlocal agreement states today that the current funding levels for the city fire department are the minimum necessary for proper function. They didn't have this reassurance in the text of the last proposal. It eventually became clear that the council members didn't have a good reason to prohibit the move. They just wanted to satisfy the union's request for more staff, read dues-paying members. Too bad fire rescue response isn't a market function. Council voted to delay the proposal indefinitely. Notwithstanding this ludicrous debate, many members of the public are already using other services to get to the ER. When I was a taxi driver, I drove at least 4 people to the ER and twice when I was with Uber. My own wife has taken Lyft. I drove her to the ER when she had pains that led to her ovarian surgery. You can read about that here. And I drove our daughter to the ER after she fell. People are choosing not to pay $600 for the transport and the poor service that generally comes along with a monopoly. After a break, the Committee of the Whole reconvened to discuss the storefront conservation corridor overlay, which the affected owners have objected to publicly. Mayor Rick Kreisman and his staff both complained that none of the offended business owners would meet with them to convey their concerns, saying that council should just move forward with the plan as a whole instead of splitting it. What didn't occur to these tyrants is that the business owners don't like the idea of new government regulations on top of the current restrictions they must already comply with and the higher taxes they're already paying due to being in a special taxing district. The reason for lack of public engagement in proposals like these and like bus rapid transit is a lack of interest in advancing the project, not a lack of input opportunities. The people affected by these actions of the government in these cases simply don't want the government to do these things, and I don't blame them. The proposal was moved forward mostly unchanged and was reconnected, but the date was changed. Instead of March 14th for the second reading of the grant program and April 18th for the zoning portion, both were moved to April 4th for second reading and public hearing. I will be in attendance to speak against them. But I will not be in attendance for the first two meetings in March. I have to spend time with my family during the first week, and I have a work-related trip for the second. I will be available for the March 21st meeting, and I'll resume regular updates for you at that time. Thanks for listening. This has been Saint Petersburg Florida Area News, a production of the Reconstructionist Radio Network.